Welcome to Transforming Data into Action. We're excited that you joined us for this discussion on how planners, agencies, organizations, and activists are using open data to promote spatial equity. Traditionally, planners and policymakers have utilized publications as a primary tool for communication and analysis, but within the last decade, technology has really become increasingly available for agencies and communities to really access and utilize data for their work. This has really provided new opportunities to understand, interact, and work with communities, often with the goal of enhancing spatial equity. Today, we brought together a really great panel that represents a diverse group of agencies, organizations, and other advocacy groups who are building applications and tools to really help plan and build a better city. In this panel, we'll discuss what inspired developing various applications and tools, what the overall process for building the apps were, and what was the overall result of the process. Unfortunately today, Dr. Blake couldn't make it, but we still have a really good panel ahead, and I'd like to give them a chance to introduce themselves and also tell us a little bit about the project.
Hi everyone, my name is Winnie Shen. I'm a housing planner with City Planning's Housing Division. And today I'm going to be talking about our Equitable Development Data Explorer. We had an earlier panel about this, so if you went to that one, you're already quite familiar. But a little bit about city planning. We're the city's primary land use agency, so we mostly do a lot of zoning. And the Equitable Development Data Explorer, as like a bit overview, is an interactive resource that equips New Yorkers with data to navigate challenging conversations about housing affordability, displacement, and racial equity in our city. There are two primary components of this tool. There's a community data portion, which is what you see right here, where you can click on a community district and you can see data disaggregated by race and ethnicity where possible, as it falls into those 5 categories listed up there. And then the second portion of the EDE or EDI is the displacement risk map, which is broken down by a slightly smaller geography, NTAs, neighborhood tabulation areas. This is illustrates the comparative displacement risk of New York City neighborhoods. We're measuring displacement here as the inability to remain in one's home, and we have that broken down by 3 subcategories of population vulnerability, market pressure, and housing conditions, and we're putting special emphasis on population vulnerability. I can talk more about how we calculate all the formulas a little bit later, but the idea is that this provides a snapshot of current conditions and doesn't provide enough information about predicting the effect that a particular land use action might have, but it's meant to more inform conversations that community members are having as they evaluate certain land use applications. And finally, the last thing is the legislation that prompted the creation of this tool also required the creation of racial equity reports, which are RERs for short, and they are reports that certain land use applications that exceed specific thresholds have to produce, and all the data that comes from RERs is pulled from the EDI. So these two aspects are very closely linked, and they also have to include, in addition to the data, a narrative summary of the project, as well as how it furthers the city's fair housing goals as outlined in HPD, Housing Preservation and Development's report of Where We Live, NYC, which I highly recommend checking out if you haven't.
Hi everyone, I'm Sara Shoener, she, her. I'm the director of a project called Equity NYC, which sits inside the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity. And I'm here today to talk about the Equity NYC data tool, which is a digital product that has come out of the social indicators and equity report that we've been producing for quite a while inside city government. And just to sort of be able to locate our conversation as we talk over the next hour, we have a portion of the Equity NYC report, which is called Mapping Equity, which is specifically a geographic distribution of about 50 or so data sets that come across city government. And it looks a little bit like this, and it includes a range of equity outcomes, so measures of population well-being, whether it's air quality or high school graduation rates, things like that. In addition to that, we have about 50 city service metrics in there, which is just where city services are located, who's receiving those services, and then also city service locations, so actual point data of things like firehouses and libraries. And one of the major things that we'll be talking about today is that a big piece of the functionality of this tool is the ability to overlay data sets on top of one another, because one of the primary audiences for this tool is decision makers and planners inside city government. And we use this tool in a couple of different ways, but mostly it's to measure two things. One, equity. So are we investing in the city according to where there is need? And so you can see in this picture, what we've got on the green shading underneath is our unemployment rates by community district. And then the overlaying data set is our Workforce One placement promotion recipients. And so we get a very quick glance as to where people are receiving services versus where we might see a disproportionate need for those services. And then second, measuring justice. So how are we accounting for the historic patterns of inequitable investment over the past decades, centuries? And so you see in this map here, we've got the green underlying is the childhood poverty rates by community district. And then on top of that, we have the measures, the distribution of our It's Our Money participants, which are part of the citywide participatory budgeting project. And so getting to take a look at how current projects that try to increase engagement are doing in comparison to where there has been historic disengagement.
Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Restrepo, and I am Transportation Alternatives Senior Organizer. Today, I'm going to be talking about our project that we did with MIT. It is a public data resource called Spatial Equity NYC. And the idea behind it is to provide a space for different stakeholders in communities and decision makers to find out what are the key metrics that produce valuable public spaces and a good quality of life, and actually create a competitive element in seeing how our city is designed so that people can better understand how their districts are performing on key metrics. There's a lot of data out there in New York City, and there are so many different maps that one can engage for one single metric. It could be for tree coverage. It could be for the existence of crashes in a specific corridor and how dangerous that community is for traffic violence. And we wanted to create something that would help people understand at a eagle's eye glance all of these different metrics for a specific community district. And there are many that we can highlight through our portal, including tree coverage, asthma rates, bike and bus infrastructure, and all of these different metrics are forming what we would like to see in a community that is thriving. As a nonprofit advocacy group, we definitely are looking towards this information in a very transparent and accountable way, but also we want to some degree, shape the conversation about our streets and about our communities to ensure that these communities can thrive. So here's a little bit of a sense of the spatial equity tool, which can be used online. One of the benefits of using this tool is that you can actually overlay different data sets at the same time. You could look at the availability of specific forms of infrastructure, but also overlay it on top of poverty rates. And you can start to draw conclusions, well, not necessarily conclusions, but you can start to build out a better idea of how the city's being designed. And oftentimes we know some of these things already. I think our consciousness is growing on how communities were designed a specific way for specific communities, but when you have the data to also back that up or to help substantiate a policy that you want to move forward, that can really be beneficial because that's what decision makers are looking for. For example, in city council districts where the majority of residents are Black, there are 68% fewer streets with protected bike lanes. Not surprising. And here's another example of how we can start to draw some inferences. Again, not necessarily a complete conclusion, but you can start to develop a higher consciousness of how our streets are developed. Here you can see the darker areas are highlighting higher surface temperatures, which during the summer we see news of people dying because it's literally so hot. And you can also cross-reference it to poverty rates, and you can see how these two things are oftentimes intersecting in the data sets. I'm going to throw it back to Andrew.
Thanks. No, I don't. Just head to the next one. Oh. So this is the portion where we're just going to have a, free-form discussion pretty much about the process. And it's really incredible the work all three of you are doing. And I guess the first real question I'd like to kick this off with is to Sara. What really made you want to build this tool? What was that kind of the inspiration for it?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Equity NYC data tool and the mapping equity piece inside of it has sprung out of the Social Indicators and Equity Report, which is a report that's been around since the 80s. It's a charter-mandated tool that actually started in DCP. And for the longest time, up until 2016, 2017, it was just one of those big books that sits on people's desks, and there's probably about 50 people who use it and read it all the time, and then that's about it. And when we really wanted to start thinking about how to center this as a tool for equity and for justice in planning, we thought, like, okay, how are we going to center equity? And obviously part of that is centering accessibility. And so we had to think about how to make this user-friendly, how to get it online, how to make it available. And so we've started the long process of taking it from a big phone book into a tool that can now be used publicly and seen by everybody, and hopefully provides an entree into some pretty complex administrative data sets in a way that people can get a quick glance as to both how people are doing in the city and how the city is responding.
That's fantastic. Juan, it looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, to kind of give a better sense of why we developed the spatial equity tool. We developed this the impetus for developing this started a few years ago when we saw that the city council and the mayor were all going to be shifting over the course of a few months. And over the past few years, we've been developing a greater consciousness amongst city council members about our issue, which focuses on streetscape and traffic fatalities and where they're really bad. And we knew that we're going to need to teach a whole new slew of elected officials about our issue, about how pernicious of an issue it is. And one of the best ways of doing that is through great data, but also like contextualizing that data in an easy way for people. So there's this really good story that Philip, one of our research director, likes to tell, which is that we went to a meeting with a city council member, someone who's very supportive of really doing a lot of the things that we want to do. And he kind of asked them a question of how many homes you think are car-free? Because a lot of times we focus on building streets where you don't necessarily need a car to thrive. You can use a bike, you can walk, you can take the bus. And the city council member responded that he thought 30% of the homes in his district were car-free. Philip responded they're actually 70%. And that's a big disparity if someone is like really supportive of our issues, but they think our issue is not so widely felt in the community, because that's going to influence policy. So we wanted to make sure that there was a tool where elected officials could easily go on and understand their district in a way that they didn't before, and that they could get correct data provided by the city. And a lot of times they don't even know where to go to get this. So we wanted to make it really easy for a decision maker or also just a community member to be able to go into spaces and say, I know what my district is like, And that was a really big impetus for creating the spatial equity tool. And there are so many different data sets that we're including in there, and we can kind of go into them, but that's just one example of how oftentimes we just don't know how good or how bad our district is, and we need the tools to be able to figure that out.
No, that's fantastic. Winnie, do you have anything to add in terms of these stories, or?
I guess just really quickly, obviously our tool is a little different because it was legislatively required for us to build it, but there was background work that went into it before the legislation was even passed. Like DCP and HPD were working and talking to other cities and just seeing what they've been doing around displacement risk prior to even the legislation being written. So it was like a conversation our agencies were having already internally about what that might look like theoretically before, we were actually forced to put pen to paper, so to speak. And also I want to highlight that this legislation was passed because of a lot of organizing work done by the Racial Impact Study Coalition, RISC, which is like a coalition of really involved housing groups. Some of them are in the room today, maybe ANHD, MSA, and RPA, these groups that are really involved around how rezonings have been affecting different communities. So I want to say there's definitely advocacy role being pushed to actually get agencies to do this and actually get some tools released. So I want to just highlight this public-private partnership.
Absolutely, in terms of really building that type of support that you need to really start the project. And that what really goes into that is you need a really strong champion as well to really get the project moving. But also, were there any examples of needing a catalyst to really help that champion start this project? Yeah, go.
I'm happy to jump. So what ended up actually being a catalyst for us too, we have an executive order that got put in place in 2019 that I think was incredibly critical for us to be doing our work, because what sits inside of the mapping equity tool is data from, I'm constantly blown away by the fact that there are, depending on how you count, about 100 different agencies in the city, from the Department of Health to the Department of Education to the Department of Transportation, and to be able to get data sets from all of those agencies that speak most critically to how the city is investing and responding to disparities is a massive amount of work. And so we needed a piece of legislation to come in, and now every year our whole team calls up every agency and talks about the data that they're giving to us, talks about the types of the distribution that they're giving us, the disaggregation that they're giving us, looking at the disparities that sit inside their data sets and what they think is sitting at the root cause of that, and what we might be able to do to address some of those root causes of the disparities in their data sets. And I don't think any of that would have happened without a really strong piece of legislation. And so, which also came from an incredible amount of advocacy work.
Can I jump in?
Huh? Yeah, go for it.
And I think more so from the nonprofit advocacy lens, I kind of mentioned that there was a choice point for us where we saw a new city council coming in, but we also felt that the way that people were talking about our issue had changed. Transportation Alternatives was predominantly a bike organization for a long time, and we saw the need to shift towards thinking about the public realm and how it's utilized. We see hurricanes that are devastating communities, and that can all be tracked to how we are building our streets and how we're paving over porous surfaces. And that's one of the key examples that people are really thinking about, of how when we build our streets a specific way, that's going to impact people's livelihoods. And sometimes the biking lens doesn't quite hit every single group the same way. So we wanted to make something that could help us talk to more constituencies and help us make our viewpoints and our lens a little bit wider so that more people could resonate with what we're trying to say. Doesn't mean that we don't talk about biking as much, but we just have a broader vocabulary to talk about these issues, because we can point to a data tool that we've created and we can say, biking is all related to sustainability, it's related to climate change, but look at how our streets themselves can be benefiting so many other important amenities that people need. So then using that new framework, we created a new advocacy message called 25 by 25, where we started talking about how we need to develop human-centered streets instead of ones that prioritize cars and driving, because we've seen that building streets that emphasize the use of cars is negatively impacting people. And that lens has really widened our appeal to many new city council members who are oftentimes really looking at their streets intersectionally as well. So we need a new way of talking to people, quite frankly.
Fantastic. We're going to go into our next section right now. If we don't go through everything, we're going to run out of time. But anyway, the great thing about having so many different types of applications, but also people from different organizations here, is that there must have been a different process in terms of how you were able to actually build and engineer these different tools. Actually, Juan, do you want to kind of kick us off in what the development process was like?
Yes, I'm happy to, Andrew. So I mentioned before that we did this jointly with MIT, which is a really interesting process. They bring in the academic and the know-how of developing a database, and they have a lot of great people involved in the project. We bring in like a focus and oftentimes like some support as well. And I think when we were developing this and when we were in conversations with MIT, our main focus was ensuring that, one, we would be using the most accurate data possible. So that is city-driven data. When you use the spatial equity tool, you're going to see tons of links and other ways where you can go from the tool itself into actual city links and city databases. And then two, we wanted to make it very transparent for people to access that data. So that's why we have so many different layers that are easily accessible.
Great. Sara. Oh.
Sure. Yeah. So the mapping equity tool took a couple of different steps before we finally figured out our footing and how to do it correctly. We've got a team of about 10 that work on this inside the city that spans across data scientists, product managers, policy experts, project managers, folks like me, all trying to put our heads together and think about how do we take all of these really, really complex administrative data sets and put them into a picture of both, one, how people are doing, and two, how the city is showing up. And so what we originally did was we worked with an outside vendor called Blenderbox, if anybody's familiar. And they were the ones that built the back end of the site for us. We went through multiple rounds of user testing. We were actually slated to launch a year before we actually did. And the first time that we built the site and started, we put it through about a month of user testing. And at the end of it, it just became very clear that people walked away with more questions than clarity. And so we scrapped the whole thing, launched the rest of the site, and then came back to focus on mapping equity by itself in a separate year, because we realized what an undertaking it was to do this in a way that just like a typical New York resident would be able to understand all of this data, and that we were able to have all of these data sets be interoperable, particularly when agencies often don't use the same categories of disaggregation in all of their record keeping, because these are administrative data sets, these aren't research data sets. So it ended up taking about an additional year of working in-house with all of our product managers and data scientists, in addition to using third-party vendors, before we could launch the whole thing. And now it's been up for about a year and a half, and we've been slowly iterating and building out new functionality as we go, adding new district boundaries on top of it, adding, all of the different transit lines, being able to overlay, other types of data, like from the census and from other like academic sources that we think are most important for people to be able to put everything into context. And so now it's just evolving over time as we're seeing where the big questions are.
Winnie, did you have a similar experience?
Not a similar experience. We had a very time-bounded requirement to get the tool up and launched. And I think, well, one thing is DCP, we were able to build it entirely in-house. We're very lucky to have a very robust data engineering team that can process all the data, and like an open source engineering team that does all the front-end development. So that was one thing we were very fortunate with. However, the legislation passed June of 2021, Local Law 78, and then it required us to have this tool up and running by April of 2022. So in less than a year, we need a fully functional interactive website. And the reason why that was like so fast was because racial equity reports were scheduled to go live by legislation of June of 2022. So we needed the tool to be live first in order for land use applicants to like use it and produce these reports. So we had less than a year. So it was very much, I think our data engineers like to describe the process of like flying a plane as you're building it. I think that was what was happening. It was like we were getting data at the same time as like HPD, DCP, members of RISC were in these working groups about what kind of data we want to see. That's like in addition of what was legislatively required to be featured on the tool. So we're in these working groups, and then we're reaching out to different agencies like NYCHA, like Health, to also get their data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And some of this data was like open source, like some was unavailable on Open Data NYC. So that's a really great resource, of course. So our data engineers are processing all of this, and then our front-end folks are producing it. And then we've been also required to update all the data each year. It's an annual update. So right now we're in our data update process. And this is also the time that we're like trying to make little tweaks to the UI to make it more user-friendly. We're getting a lot of feedback from folks, which we did at our last session. So yeah, it's definitely growing. I think many of the fallbacks of the tool as it is, even though I think personally it's great, is because of how short of a timeline that we had to get it up and running.
No, I think there's like one common theme really that's coming out of this right now, which is the importance of data. Sara, did you feel like you had all the data you needed for your tool?
No. But it's been, I would say, and even now, we're probably, I would say at about like 85%. I was emailing with Winnie not 48 hours ago about new data that we're hoping to pull over from the EDD that we think will make a great additional layer to our data set. And obviously, as the world and as the city is growing and changing, there's always going to be like ways that we need to be adjusting to that. But in year one, we had three main data sets. It was DCP's facilities database, which we still pull from quite regularly. We had a lot of ACS data, and then we had a lot of data from the Mayor's Office of Contracting Services, which has information about like where all of our contracted social services are and like where all of those locations are. So that's where we started, of just like those big pieces. And then since then, now it takes about 2 months, I would say, every year of speaking with, we do house calls, we go to every single agency and talk to them and say like, okay, big three things. What are the data sets that you think are like the core pillars that help you fill your mission? So for something like DOT, we've got, leading pedestrian intervals, bike lanes, where the city bikes are, where the road resurfacing is happening, things like that. So like once we like put all of these things together, like do we have like a nice universe of everything that you do? Where are the data sets that if we disaggregate them by either demographics like race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or by geography like community district, NTA, we actually see something important about how the city is investing? And then 3, where do we see like long-term investments so that we can follow it over time and understand, depending on like what's happening in the world, who's in power, who's making decisions, we can start tracking like how these things are changing and how power is moving through these decisions. And so we continue, as you may know, people may only not like to talk about data, like they only like to talk about data less than they want to talk about inequality. And so to talk about both of those things together has been a years-long process of building relationships and building trust and not building a punitive data culture where there's a worry from city agencies that if we put this stuff online, it's going to create trouble. And so getting to a place where we can say, hey, we know that you didn't cause these problems that started 400 years ago, but now that we're sitting in these positions, we are responsible for changing them. And so getting to that place has been slow, but hopeful every year. And so I would say we're about 85%. As leadership changes, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we're moving in a great direction in terms of transparency.
No, that's great. And, in terms of, building relationship, building trust in order to move these types of tools forward, I'm just going to open this to the general group. Were there any other kind of obstacles or friction points while trying to build these tools?
I think, when you're creating a tool, you have to think like, who are you doing it for? So when we created the spatial equity tool, our goal was to ensure that the data could be used in one of 2 ways. One is if you are looking for data from a community district, or 2, if you're looking for it in a council district. Oftentimes data is provided in census tracts, and that can be limiting for how people use it from an advocacy lens, because if you say, my district has so few trees, or this census tract, which includes a specific council member, has so few trees, that's not the exact scope of what they politically care about or where their constituency is. So we had to mold the data in a way where it would allow it to focus on these 2 specific zones, because community boards and city council members are 2 of the biggest points of entry for people to create change in New York City. And if you're providing census tracts, it's a lot more limited. So from a creating the tool perspective, it was a little difficult to have to remold data to include that specific focus.
That's a great point in terms of that. Keeping up with our time, we'll move to our third part, which is really trying to think about the overall resultant impact of these tools. Probably the most exciting part about development is really when you get to see your tool finished and people can actually start using it. Does anyone have any interesting stories about when they're about to launch this tool?
I guess it's been interesting because our tool also has a land use application effect, as that it feeds into these racial equity reports, which are only required for specific land use applications that exceed certain thresholds. So most of the projects that I've been getting that have RERs attached to them are those that increase permitted residential zoning square footage by 50,000, which is around roughly 50 units. So slightly sizable residential projects. And it's been interesting because as part of the RERs, they also have to include a residential affordability breakdown. And I think that's one thing that makes the RER really unique from the rest of the environmental assessment situation, is because those numbers are based on projected maximum, worst case scenarios, if the developer were to build the largest possible thing they could fit there, while the RER is meant to more reflect what the developer is intending to actually build there. So it's a closer approximation of what actual affordability will be created by that project. So I think that's been really interesting, and that I think created the most discussion. So right now, because of how new of a requirement it is, just launched this past June, I think the most feedback we've gotten as at the commission level, the CPC, has been really looking at those tables and offering interesting feedback about, okay, this affordable housing development, and then looking at the market rate rents and seeing how those numbers are sort of comparable. So that's been interesting, and we're really excited to see what the rest of the participants, the ULURP process, the community board, other community members in general, are what they're going to say to the RER. And I think they're going to naturally also go to the EDE, of course, and double check those numbers and see what other stories they can tell. So I think it's still very early on, but I think there's a lot of exciting stories that are going to come from the tool.
Test.
I think one of the most gratifying pieces of working on this project is really now being a part of all of the discussions that are happening inside city agencies as a result of seeing their data displayed geographically. I won't name names, but we had an agency that just came to us the other day, and because they had seen some of their data in some of these maps and reached out and said, hey, this stuff looks really bad. Can we like talk to you about like what it means? Like, this doesn't seem right. And like, where are you getting this data? And I said, oh, we're getting it from your colleagues. This is your data. And we like walked through and showed them that like, yes, indeed, this wasn't erroneous, that this was in fact showing like pretty egregious disparities in the way their investments were being distributed across the city. And over the course of an hour of like really talking this through and sort of, it's a lot of having conversations about remembering why we're doing this work, remembering that, you know, we're here to be investing in the public good, and just to like, it can be really scary to see this stuff at first because it's bad, and then remembering like this is exactly why we're here, and this is our chance to actually like make different kinds of choices to like slowly turn that ship. And so without being able to speak in like an incredible amount of specifics, it's been, these tools are only as good as their use, right? And so making sure that we're not just having agencies be the data sources, but also the data recipients, and remembering to continue to iterate and to continue to go back and like show them their data once it's in the tool and talk to them about what we're seeing has been, I think, the most critical part of having real impact.
Looks like you want to say something?
Yeah, I actually want to talk about the post-launch, if that's possible.
No, that's great.
So we released Spatial Equity NYC out, and as I mentioned before, there's a little bit of a competitive element to the tool where you can compare city council districts. We started to see in a few different levels people engaging with the tool in kind of the ways that we were hoping, which is really exciting. We saw that people in the press were creating articles where, let's say, The Patch, which is like a hyper-local news company, they were saying, like, these are indicators in Astoria that you didn't know are as bad as they are, like a lack of park space. Even though it has Astoria Park, there's like a general lack of park space in other areas of Astoria. We started to see that the people who are influencers in our community were going on Twitter, and they were using the tool to look at their specific district, and they were highlighting, oh, look at the asthma rates, or oh, look, you know, we were seeing that the data was becoming transparent, and people's consciousness was being raised, and they were highlighting it and looking for solutions more than anything, and they were looking to have their voices heard. And I think the most exciting thing was the City Council Transportation Committee Chair, Councilmember Brooks Powers of Southeast Queens, said that she was addicted to our tool, which is really exciting. That's really, really exciting. That's a very powerful person, influential in our space, who is using our tool, and she is seeing her district, how it needs improvements in a variety of different metrics. That is someone with the influence to share our tool. And I'll just let it keep going.
No, it's great when your work
sign.
goes viral overall. Yeah, I mean, did you guys like have any similar experiences in terms of just, you know, it's great when it's like, you wouldn't usually expect, you know, these types of tools to really get like that type of traction, especially in like groups that you wouldn't usually expect too.
We haven't gone Twitter famous yet, but
okay.
I'm waiting for it.
Well, I guess, you know, did overall, did things really turn out the way you expected it to?
I would say I've been really happy with how much it's been picked up internally and how much different agencies are using our tool to make their decisions around investments, budgeting, staffing, those types of things. Where we haven't seen as much of a pickup is outside of city government. We look at all of our Google Analytics and everything, and we're not seeing the same kind of just like a usage that sits beyond decision makers, which for now is okay, but kind of isn't the point. Like, we were trying to create like a level of transparency that we just haven't seen. And so I think that a lot of what this year is going to be is making sure that we get out from behind our desks and we're actually like out into the world, which as a lifelong bureaucrat and data scientist is like not my strong suit on like either realm. But I think that that's like part of the work of growing in city government, is making sure that we're also not just like all talking to ourselves all the time.
Yeah, at this point, I guess we'd like to open it up to the floor. I think I see Claire.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for this really powerful and insightful panel. I'm sure everyone is learning a lot from both the moderator and the panelists. I just want to first give a shout out and then ask a quick question. I want to give a quick shout out to American Planning Association Tech Committee. Our wonderful moderator here, Andrew, is the co-chair of the Tech Committee. So Savannah sitting next to me and myself. So if you're interested in contents like this about using technology and data for equity, come find us. That's the shout out. Hi, everyone. The quick question for everyone is, so first of all, it's such a powerful panel, and I'm sure everyone else is also touched and moved. So what is one call to action you would give to the audience members sitting here and watching online? Like, what can we do to support the equity tools, and what can we do to use it for good?
I can start us off. I would recommend really using the tool. So it's that if you just Google Equitable Development Data Explorer, it'll come up. And if you have any feedback, we're definitely, like I mentioned, we're in our annual update right now. Like, this would be a great time to send us your feedback. So there's a contact form on that website, but it's also just edde@planning.nyc.gov. That email goes to me, so I will read it, and then I will definitely try our best to incorporate it if possible. So yeah, heavily recommend using it if you have a chance.
I'm going to echo Winnie, and I'm just going to say use our tool. We really make it in a way where you can look at your specific district and learn a lot more about your community and the place that you live. And you can also use that information to demand change. So that's Spatial Equity.NYC, and you can learn more about transportation alternatives at transalt.org, and we'll help you take some of the things that you learn and turn it into positive change for the community.
Yeah, it's not anything different, but I would say at the end of the day, what we're looking for is accountability here. And so going and looking at it's equity.nyc.gov and really taking a look at the issues that you care about most, seeing how we're doing as a city, talking about it publicly, talk with your friends, talk with the internet, talk with people in power about where we're falling short, where you think we're doing all right. And also, if there are ways that we could be improving our tool, we also have a contact form, equity@cityhall.nyc.gov. And we're always looking for ways to be able to make this more usable and more accessible for folks.
I'll take yours, and then I saw a gentleman back there.
Thanks so much for doing this talk. I was wondering if any of you built in any very deliberate feedback loops that validate whether or not you're accomplishing your mission when building these tools. As a tool maker myself, sometimes I hear praise, and it's great, and praise feels really nice, but at the end of the day, we're building things ultimately to make a visible difference. So I was curious if any of you have built in any feedback loops into your work.
Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, we have a report card for the spatial equity tool that you can find on our website under the report section. And I think we're also very responsive to pushing the city's Department of Transportation to create the change that we want to see on our streetscape. And that's sort of an indirect tool that we can use to evaluate our tools. Sort of at the end of the day, our goal is to push others to do things using the tool. So if we're doing that, then that's another form of evaluation for it.
I believe you had a question.
So I guess my question is kind of building off the first one about how how to support the work you guys are doing. And I know one response was to use the tool and particularly use it to advocate for change. I guess this might be more of a general question, but as someone who's not super familiar with how New York City politics works, I know there's community boards. When you say that, is it as simple as going up to your community board and saying, hey, I noticed in the Spatial Equity Explorer that we have a really low per capita amount of parks. Is that something is that something that actually gets change done? Is that something that an individual person can do? Should you recommend joining organizations? It's a very broad question, but any insight you have would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah.
It's a really great question, and it lets me pitch, so thank you. So our organization is a nonprofit advocacy org, but there are many that exist in different issue areas. Obviously, we focus more on transportation. We have a system of volunteer organizing for every borough that you can learn more about, and I'm happy to talk with you after this. But to more broadly answer for everybody, every time that you email your elected officials who represent you and you say that some issue is important to you and maybe add the context that you learn from our tool, that is like a little tick check that makes them care about that issue a little bit more. So it's kind of like when they say every vote counts, but at a greater scale, because our city council members don't operate at the same level as like a national level election. Like these individual reach out opportunities actually have a really great impact more often than not. So I guess to answer your question, one is find a community where you can get involved and you can share the data that you're learning, and you can get put into many more spaces to utilize it. And two, definitely reach out to your elected officials and let them know about the issues that you care about and the data that you're using to talk about it.
Anyone else want to add?
I guess really quickly, from a land use perspective, all of the land use applications that get sent to DCP also have public hearings that are all published on our website. There's a calendar, so you can totally look at EDE for some cool data points to bring up at those public hearings to tell the commissioners. But also relatedly, I want to echo the importance of being connected to organizations. Would definitely recommend checking out whatever issue areas that you're interested in. But yeah, just from a land use perspective, we got public hearings. We also have some info sessions coming up because we are working on some citywide text amendments affecting zoning in different areas. We got one this Monday, I believe. So definitely check out, calendars for events that agencies are holding. We definitely want members of the community to participate and share their feedback.
I believe I saw a question back there.
Hi, thank you, panel. I just want to add, as a community board member former, you could also go to the community board, introduce a letter of support with your nonprofit or group or resolution, have that passed, and that gets sent to the city council member, borough president, who will appoint the community board member. So that's a very, very good way to try to get the ear of politicians. My question is, in terms, you talked about administrative data sets and how they all differed. It came up in another panel about standardization. Are there any recommendations that you have that Blender Box came up with? Do you think there should be an investigation at the committee level in city council and then some legislative proposals to get this done? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that we struggle with all the time, and I think we have to, particularly as it relates to the standardization of demographic categories. Based on whether you're in the Department of Health or NYPD, the level of disaggregation that you need around people's experiences, identities, where they live is going to be really different. And so having everything be completely standardized is not what we're looking for. And in a lot of ways, sometimes a level of granularity is really important to be able to get contextualized information. Sometimes it can be unsafe. Like, we are still the capital S state, and we, want to make sure that like we're only taking in as much information as we need to be taking in to be doing good work for residents. And so what we recommend is at least to be able to have everybody's data categories roll up to a set of standardized categories. And so for a while, there was a lot of mismatch in how folks were doing categorization across different identities, whether it was gender, whether it was race, ethnicity, and just making sure that at the end of the day, like even if people were disaggregating into further granular categories, they were like rolling up to the same ones so that we could start overlaying them on top of one another. But what that looks like at the highest level continues to change. Some of you might be familiar with the fact that at the federal level, the OMB is now rethinking some of its like racial and ethnic categories. And they're also rethinking how they're going to collect that data. They're going to collapse the race and ethnicity categories. They're adding Middle Eastern, North African. There's a couple other things. And so making sure that we're not only like staying lined up with that, but we're also staying a step ahead of it, because as New York, we're the best city in the country anyway. And so we should be doing better than what the federal mandate is. And so every year we have a citywide demographic data working group that has representatives from about 10 different agencies. And we're constantly talking about what the standard is that we want to set for everybody, and how to make sure that everybody can meet those standards at the same time. So we've got a really, civil servants are the coolest, and there's a lot of them that are like really trying hard to like make it work. And so I actually worry a little bit about legislative mandates because they're not nimble. They fail to take in a lot of the detail that sits at the implementation level. And so we see a lot of unintended consequences that come out of that kind of legislation. But that's not to say that when we're not moving as quickly as we should be, or as courageously as we should be, that it's not the right move.
I believe I saw a question over there.
Do you guys do any work around monitoring school enrollment and the trends on where things may look like 5 years from now, 3 years from now, if things keep going the way they are now on your platform?
We don't do any prediction. We only do reporting of the past year. And so right now we've got trend data that goes back probably about 15 years or so that starts from like kind of third grade levels of like math, ELA, absentee, that kind of stuff, up through high school graduation and then into college readiness and like college graduation rates. And that cuts across all sorts of different demographic categories. We also cut it with race, ethnicity, and gender at the same time. And then we have a bunch of stuff mapped. And so you can see the trends. And it's one of the data sets that we point to a lot, because most of the time when we think about success at the city level, we think in aggregate. Are high school graduation rates going up and down? Are incarceration rates going up and down? And while that gives us like one set of understanding of how we're doing, once you disaggregate, it tells a completely different story, and that's where we're not seeing success. And so we hope that being able to continue to show that even though things are moving generally in the right direction, those disparities are not going away, and in some ways getting a lot worse. We hope that we can continue to point to that as a way to be held to account.
So I think we have like less than 5 minutes left. I'd like to kind of close this with one last question. And that is, if you had one piece of advice to give to anyone here that's starting the process you guys went through, what would it be?
I can't speak for this exactly because I'm not the person who spearheaded making it happen, but something that he said, Philip Mikowski from our team, was that he sort of thought, who is the dream partner for this specific data? And the team at MIT are some of the foremost experts in spatial equity. So he sort of reached for the stars in a sense. And I know that's really cheesy, but this product wouldn't be so good if he didn't work with that team. And sometimes that's really important, that you recognize that you can only do so much alone and that you need partnerships, and that you ensure that the partnerships that you do form are the ones that are going to help you achieve the final product that you want. And he's working on future iterations of this with that same team. So there's that degree of wanting to build the best thing together and wanting to keep it going and all those important things.
I guess the one advice I would have is being really accepting that it's a very iterative process, especially because, like I mentioned it now probably 100 times, we had a short timeline, but being accepting that it's really important, like from these panels that I've been doing today, of getting all the feedback from audience members has been really useful. And like the Risk Coalition, like they also released some video series on ADHD's website. And I'm hoping like through all these different avenues of us doing engagement, we get more of that feedback, but also being really open to like the fact that people are using this tool and they're gonna realize different ways of using it than like maybe we had intended, especially because we built it entirely in-house. So there's like a bit of an echo chamber, I suppose, at times. But we're really open to like feedback and recognizing, even though sometimes like what they want might not be like possible with the data sets that are currently available, but like trying to encapsulate the intent for what they're trying to look for in the tool itself is something that we're still exploring.
I think going into this, I really underestimated the power of relationships and trust building in getting the data that we needed to be able to do the work well. We spent the first 3 years just trying really hard to describe things as accurately and as comprehensively as possible. And that required just an incredible amount of relationship building, and it has continued to be that way over time, and being able to figure out the best uses for it. And, you know, in a lot of ways, I went into data and I went into government because I like to do most of my conversations with a machine, and so making sure that I was cutting against that instinct and talking with the folks that I intended to be able to use it was really important.
Oh, thank you guys so much. This has been a fantastic panel, fantastic discussion.